We are Julia Dick and Amanda Harvey, aka the XX Files. We're an intersectional feminist media collective working to explore all aspects of our techno world from the perspective of women, non-binary, and queer folks. We could also be considered the oral satellite to Montreal-based feminist media space Studio XX.
We host a weekly radio show on CKUT at 90.3 FM.
It's every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m.
Alongside two monthly internet radio shows, one on Montreal's Antennas and one on Francis Camp. We research, write, and produce all of our shows, as well as present live audiovisual performances and DJ sets. We've organized a shortwave pirate radio festival for Montreal's Nuit Blanche. And we're currently working on a shortwave radio installation for Pop Montreal Festival. And we also just hosted a radio camp for teenagers just last week.
So our work is interested in the potential for experimentation and disembodied performance. We look to dissect the themes of identity production, transmission, memory creation, sonic ownership, and boundaries. We also look to demystify technological function while deepening our understanding of radio production.
Today, we will reflect on the concept of noise, which is not on the slide behind us. But we'll continue, and perhaps the slideshow will match up in a moment. So we are exploring the reliance of our sonic universe's tendency to be separated into binaries. So these including meaningful and unmeaningful, the desirable and the undesirable, and the musical and the non-musical. We are aiming to disrupt these divisions and move towards more liminal definitions and the spaces in between them.
There is a growing sense that noise, whether as concept, metaphor, or phenomena, matters to understanding our contemporary and highly mediated society. Expanding on the parallels between noise and marginality, our discussion will span the poles of the conservative politics of silence to the transgressive possibilities for noise to speak back to the reductive nature of binaries. So please join us in welcoming our panelists. And if you could each just introduce yourselves.
How long?
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, my name is Suzanne Kite. I make art under my last name, Kite. And I'm here as half of the team of Unheard Records. Have notes just so I don't forget anything about myself or what I do with my life. All right, so the other half of my team is it's myself and Mint Park, who makes art under the name Baka. And we started this record label, Unheard Records, coming out of the CalArts in Los Angeles. We were both composers in a program, and that was another program in CalArts was the music tech program, and there were almost no women in that program. And so, you know, seeing that and then also experiencing, you know, pretty sexist venues in LA and very few opportunities, we decided we needed to start a record label, start throwing shows, start a radio show called Ghost Frequencies, and create a venue for ourselves since there was none. And so since then we consider all of our collaborators who have been on our compilations and played our shows as part of our team. We are our short-term goals right now are to show more, to have audiovisual releases as well as sonic releases, to continue to work internationally. MIT is based in Seoul, South Korea. And yeah, my moment talking about the Unheard Records, I just want to say that we have a call for submissions right now. And we want as many people to submit as possible, because the more people we know about, the more connections we can make across the board. So yeah, please, if you're an artist out there, you know, reach out to us. We're going to be kind of really similar to this theme that we're talking about today. Our theme of our next compilation is going to be infinite in-betweens, like really small spaces, the cracks between things. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jan Tomorrow, and I facilitate a series that is called Practice, and I've been calling it a series of noise meditations. It's something I started with Mikhail Tobias, and he'll be here later this week at MUTEC. And I think this series is really trying to speak to like a lot of these liminal spaces between the binaries that have been mentioned so much. So trying to create a listening setting that is a little bit different from other settings where we do public communal listening. So something that like really allows for the personal experience, but in a collective. So it's like quite a calm, minimal event. And it's here in Montreal, and it's monthly, and it's held mostly at Never Apart Gallery.
I don't know if I need to do this again. Hi, I'm
Totally up to you.
I'm Marie Thompson. If you've come in late, I'm an educator at the University of Lincoln. I'm also a researcher. I wrote a book about noise that was kind of trying to think about noise beyond the kind of binary definitions that we get of that. And maybe I can say a little bit about just to fill the time, sure. For my reasons for writing that, actually. And I guess this was to do with the kind of gap between rhetorical representations of noise within kind of sound theory and my experience in practice. I'm not like a capital P practitioner. I do things on a kind of very, very low-key basis with like 5 people in a room. It's that kind of thing. But my experience of experimental noise shows was not the kind of, you know, overwhelming transgressive experience, which was often how noise was being understood in discourse and writing about noise, and often was something much more subtler, much more complicated than this kind of like out-of-body experience or whatever. So I kind of ended up writing about this as a way of kind of thinking through some of those kind of complex relations between the kind of rhetorical representations and investments in noise and what perhaps was going on in practice as well. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, great.
Thanks. I filled my time.
Hi, I'm Delia Beatrice. I produce and DJ as Debit. I have a background in radio, and currently I'm pursuing a master's in audio engineering. Within my production practice, I work both with dance music and ambient. I started out doing experimental music and also kind of really influenced by the noise scene and sort of the East Coast post-industrial moment when that was still a thing. And I think throughout these 10 years that I've been producing, I've been sort of wanting to make the format a little bit more accessible so that the content can be a little bit stronger. So like my last release sort of did speak about gender, but sort of in like more esoteric ways. Like it was based on Women Who Run with the Wolf, and like the concept of animus, or just like possessing the spectrum of gender and manifesting that differently, and how that could be a source of identifying oppression or sort of overcoming it. And so speaking of that thematically and trying to have the format sort of follow that. So I guess in terms of how my work relates to the topic of the panel, I grew up in Mexico, and I'm currently in a label that's mostly men, and it's pretty heteronormative, or well, in some respects it's normative, and I think in that respect infiltrating, like being able to promote and sort of make experimental work in format, and also attempting to have these themes sort of be discussed within frameworks of club music, or attempting to speak of like pop or like more superficial things such as like being femme, but still being really wanting to make compelling or deconstructive work in format, and just sort of navigating within that, both with the genres that I work with, but also like with my personal manifestations. Yeah, and basically, I guess, in a nutshell, that's my work.
Awesome. Thank you guys for being here today. No PowerPoint?
There's been a formatting mishap, but you know what? They were pretty minimal anyways, so no problem.
We're just going to jump right in. We're going to start with the question of performance. So the nature of performance, both in experimental and commercial facets, is at once embodied and disembodied, as well as reflexive and unconscious. So what is the relationship between embodiment and sound? And further, how is sound embodied on an individual scale? Suzanne, would you like to start?
Sure. I'll also use this to say what I do academically. I'm a PhD student at Concordia, and currently my practice is building body interfaces, and has been for a while. I wore my big hair today because I've just completed a project with a braid interface. And one of the really interesting things about these topics that you presented about, and hearing this talk beforehand, a lot of the similarities and differences between indigenous sonic practices and ways of listening, and feminist, like Western feminist ways of listening and sonic practices. And one thing that collides in those, I feel, is the act of listening with the body. And I could talk about the differences all day, but that similarity is what it does is it lets you listen beyond sound. The idea of listening doesn't have to be sonic. It can be visual. It can be more than all those things. Yeah, I think I'll cut myself off there.
Yeah. Jump in, anybody?
I guess when you were talking, I was kind of thinking about what you were saying, and thinking about the idea of how we listen, and how there are many different kinds of listening, and that through listening we are making meaning of the thing we're listening to, it's happening in a time and a space, and so in that way it's becoming embodied through our own interpretation. And listening, I think, is something is seen as quite feminine and passive and set back, but it can also be something that is very active and requires a lot of consciousness. And so I think that there's many different kinds of listening, and ourselves as humans, we can listen very consciously, and then I think that we're listening in other ways that are less conscious, that maybe can come to us later, or that we're not quite aware of. And so this idea of embodiment and listening and reflectivity and reflexivity, and whether or not we're conscious of that, I think that there's so many different layers there. And listening is something that can happen in the moment, and then later again when you reflect on what you had listened to before. And maybe there are some times when you are listening but you're not aware of what you're listening to. I'll stop there for now.
I guess I find this such a kind of complex and loaded binary in so many ways. The notion of disembodied sound is, I guess there has been that fancy around electronic music of kind of disembodiment and the kind of possibilities of that. But there's also a whole series of fantasies around the embodiment of sound that we are increasingly seeing marketed to us as well. So while there are the kind of amazing kind of feminist histories around embodiment and sonics, we're also seeing, you know, the ways in which this is being kind of reiterated with things like different speakers systems that focus on different bodily areas as well. And this kind of idea of sound as kind of something offering kind of a sensuous bodily experience is something that's kind of being opened up. So it's not, I guess I feel that the kind of discussion around embodiment often takes place within kind of feminist discourses, but I think there are other kind of trains of kind of embodiment and sound that kind of perhaps resonate in interesting ways with this. I guess I kind of feel that I'm never quite sure when sound is disembodied, actually. I think that's probably why I'm finding this so hard to comment on, because I'm not quite sure where the disembodied sound is. I think we can identify lots of fantasies around disembodiment, but I'm not sure that that's a kind of thing that happens.
Yeah, for me, it's like a little bit more basic, and I think this is a driving force behind my practice, both in production and with engineering, especially with mastering. Just well, beyond the binary, but just seeing the history of what has predominated and who sort of has educated us socially as to like what sounds should be where, and sort of those logics that are ultimately subjective, and just wanting to be able to sort of break a little bit with that normalcy, also with song structure and stuff like that. Yeah, so it becomes a little bit more basic in terms of wanting to create different ways of creating different focuses, both with the sounds that we can actually perceive, but then also literal vibrations, you know, like there's stuff that perhaps we can't recognize sonically, but it's still vibrating and the frequencies are still there in our bodies. And yeah, but just, I guess I'll cut it off there.
Can we talk a little bit about like what some of these fantasies of like disembodied sound would be?
Definitely.
I'm on the edge of this couch.
I'm like wanting to run away, right? Well, I mean, I guess like the entire like history of, I guess it's a mixture of like disembodiment, but also invisibilization of the body, right? So if we think about dominant practices of electroacoustic music, for example, that are often about kind of withdrawing the kind of performer body, the kind of dark space, kind of abstracting that kind of labor from the process. And yeah, just some of the kind of, I think some of the desires around computer music as well, the idea of kind of moving beyond the human in a particular way is also about a kind of move beyond the body. And there are lots of kind of interesting ways in which that's done. I don't think there's one way of kind of, you know, situating that kind of thing. So I'm not just trying to kind of lump everything together here. But I think there is a particular fantasy about transcending the human, which is partly about embodiment as well.
Can I speak to that? Because I was thinking, you know, as you're speaking, and I was thinking about, you know, the question of can anything ever be disembodied? And you know, my practice is very informed by my research into Lakota ways of knowing. I'm Oglala Lakota, and in that way of knowing, you have. You really dissolve the idea of what's allowed to have a body or what's allowed to have a soul, or and when you get away from that, you see that anything could be seen as having a body, and it just takes, you know, maybe stepping into a different context, a different way of looking at it. I especially think this with technology, not especially this high, like it's really a high technology. I don't know what the term for, you know, besides that quote you had earlier. Yeah. So when you allow your technology to have a body in itself, you know, that's a big question. Like, you know, the things that we make our technology out of come from somewhere. They come from as cheesy as it is, they come from the earth, and yeah, and that if you think of the earth as a body, rocks as a body, the minerals that we mine to make our equipment with as having a body, then suddenly, I mean, listening to those things becomes mind-blowing to me. So.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's cheesy to emphasize that at all. I think we need to keep emphasizing that these things come from somewhere, and they come from somewhere important, and they also come from labor processes and things like this as well. I think it's absolutely crucial to hang on to that, and I think that that point of emphasis can really start messing with some of this kind of logic as well.
And well, just to piggyback on that, I think also, right, like expanding from anthropocentrism when we're thinking about vibrations and frequencies, sonic or in any other manifestation. But yeah, I think it could be political to, you know, de-anthropocentrize all, or whatever, I don't know how to, yeah, to not be anthropocentric when we are thinking about, right, just that.
So are there elements of sound that have the ability to express beyond their quantifiable and qualifiable qualities, so kind of beyond the body, beyond the wave, and beyond the notation?
Can you repeat that?
Or rephrase.
Repeat it? Are there elements of sound that have the ability to express beyond their quantifiable and qualifiable qualities? So kind of beyond the body, beyond the notation, beyond the wave, beyond the vibration.
So separated from the, like the signal source, like the
Exactly,
sound
the
itself.
signal source, or even how it's qualified as a noise itself, because every sound
Right.
is attached to a signifier.
Right.
I mean, I'm gonna say there's a thing that like do we have to define sound as something that has a sound wave, or listening as something that we only listen to things that have sound? Because I think we're always constantly, listening is an amazing word. It does many actions at once. It goes in and out of things that can't even make sounds. I mean, you think about, the saying in practices of like channeling's a great, because if you say like you talk about spiritual channeling, you're automatically talking about listening to something that has no sound and can't be quantified. It can barely be explained. How do we explain that when you listen through or listen beyond something that is describable?
Perfect.
It's a really hard question. I mean, I kind of feel like, I don't know, am I saying the obvious thing of like, well, yeah, like, of course, sound is never just kind of waves and, kind of vibrations. Of course it functions on other levels. Of course it functions in relation to the social hierarchies that we are kind of referring to today. And I think one of the kind of hard things to figure out is often how far that logic goes down. So I'm acutely aware that Tara Rogers is in my eye line, but Tara's work looking at where the wave metaphor comes from, we can't even begin to talk about beyond the wave when we also need to situate where that metaphor actually comes from, and where, that thing that is so naturalized to us now, right? We talk about sound waves as if, it was always ever thus, but actually, that comes from a particular time and a particular place and a particular imagination that has its own cultural and political history. So in that regard, I'm not even sure beyond is the right term. I think it's probably around, or I don't know. I don't know how to frame it.
And I mean, I can't speak directly through that question, but the thing that comes to mind is just how with listening or hearing, like our ears are the only orifice we can't actually close, or within our 5 or however many senses. It's sort of like the one where there is this sort of reception that's involuntary. I mean, to an extent, of course, there's ways of blocking it. But yeah, I just wonder what impact that sort of physiology has to do with that. Yeah, the question of noise, or sort of like the cultural understanding of sound.
I guess to kind of connect that back to your earlier question as well, we always have an imagined body receiving sound. So this idea, this kind of notion that we can't close our ears, for example, comes from a particular dominant understanding of capacity for hearing, for a start. It comes from a particular imagination of the ear. And I think that's really revealing, again, to kind of go back to the previous binary and to connect this up. There is an imagined body that functions in relation to sound as well. And there is an imagined capacity of that body as well that might not be accurate for many of us.
Yeah, what you're saying makes me think about the idea of the different kinds of listening we do. When we're sleeping, we're listening much more differently than when we're awake. And then when we're really listening or doing some sort of deep listening, we hear so much more or less, depending on what we're doing. We can actually focus our hearing and block out hearing with our own consciousness and intention to hear or not hear. And how many times has someone also just said something to you 1,000,000 times and you've not heard it a single time? So I think that the influence of sound is a little bit of something what we're talking about now. How much influence does sound have on us, and how receptive are we to that? And then how much do we let that shape what we do and how we interact with the world? And how much is sound influencing the space and the things people in that space?
I guess I was just thinking, Mutek, the experience of listening, or the way we listen on the dance floor, which is way different, and I feel like it should have its own special word, because it's not quite, it's more than listening. I mean, as we've probably all experienced, boundaries and not boundaries, binaries really get broken on the dance floor. The way we listen, the way we subjugate our bodies, it's a really special place. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Great. We're going to move on to the next question. This one just said noise. You can imagine. So I wonder, what is the role of noise in your practice? And do you believe that noise has the potential to redefine systems of value? Perhaps we'll start with you, Delia.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because I used to make noise music when I started sort of experimenting in experimental music. Yeah, and it had everything to do with sort of going against what we've all been talking about, the cultural, sort of the cultural meaning around the way we understand these things, or the canons with which we grew up with that are, inherently, well, in my case, they were Western, even though I grew up in Mexico, but there's, both with classical and with pop music, there was a weird colonial import-export, mostly imported. So I feel subconsciously I was really interested in experimental music when I discovered electronic music, because it permitted sort of being able to operate outside of these institutions that, though I wasn't interested in sort of expanding. And I felt like noise music was sort of this domain where I could sort of take a lot more authorship, make more, I don't know, generate a meaning with the performance of it in the gear, or working on creating the gear that was mostly oscillators, because it was just noise music. And finding, it was definitely not emancipatory, especially in the context I was in, that it was very white male and very exclusive. So even infiltrating into that was its own thing. But yeah, noise music definitely had a part of me that felt that it was a deconstructive effort of practices outside of that genre. So I think that's why I started out there. And it's funny because now I make ambient, which I actually think it's sort of the other end of the spectrum, and they sort of connect in a way. So yeah.
I can talk about how I use noise or facilitate others using noise. With the noise meditation, our hope was to allow a space for listening, and we specifically chose the word noise to open things up and to go beyond, we actually argued for a while about like what's noise and what's sound, and like got pretty lost in that and didn't come up with any answers or definitions, but we stuck with noise to get out of like wanting it to be strictly about sound, and or even musicality, and like wanting to offer like as much opportunity for whatever artist was going to be there to do what worked best for them. And we were hoping with our practice to create a space that would be very attentive, like a meditation, but not really offer healing. And so we wanted to also stray away from the idea of sound meditation because it was getting very close into the healing domain, which we thought was too big of a thing to take on for us. Like we couldn't be held responsible for that, and it was quite a large thing. But so we really picked noise to like offer people a very large range of material to work with, and content to explore. And value-wise, like the reason why we were doing that is to like give space for experiment and give space for developing awareness and being attentive. And so we like didn't want to like use a lot of like labels and categories for what we were doing. We were trying to like be pretty vague.
I guess for Unheard Records, we really love to include experimental works that often have aspects of noise or employ noise logics, which and in my own practice, one thing that I always associate noise with when I work is, first of all, with error. I guess that's a large theme here. When you listen to noise, you can listen through that and start to hear things because your brain starts to put things together. And one thing that I really love about noise is its relationship now to the idea of data. And my practice it definitely includes some sonification practices. That's where you take data and you sonify that. You try to go one direct. You take numbers or ideas of numbers, ideas of data as noise, and then try to turn that into sound. And I think I love sonification. It's boring to some people, but I think it's the most interesting practice to do because a lot of our world now boils down to data. These ideas of our data being mined, what are data controlling us, numbers controlling us, and I think noise goes hand in hand with that. And exploring that is very revealing, I think.
Can I ask you a question about that? Yeah. So you assign like a musical value to the numeric data, and from there, like it's processed and...
That's totally, yeah, you could totally do that.
Okay.
You can really
so there's
like a million ways. That's why it's so great. Because it's the same thing as it's composing. It's just like any compositional thing.
Exactly. That's what
Yeah, you can, there's infinite ways to, because there's infinite numbers. And there's infinite ways of organizing things, and basically, it's up to each composer or music maker to, and then you could fall down the black hole of compositional decision making. But
that really resonated with me because I think ultimately, like at least in some contexts, noise is defined that like, once you assign a value, a cultural value that can generate some meaning, subjective or to a broader group, then now it's not noise, So I think it's really, that's just sort of the association I made, like literally hacking that concept. Yeah, super cool.
I guess it's important as well to remember that noise has often been kind of posited as this space of freedom or kind of opportunity around value and the questions of value, and kind of certainly in relation to like mainstream musical practices or dominant musical practices. It's, as you were describing earlier, and there's good reason for that in terms of the kind of value systems that potentially in some instances can be opened up. But I guess like for me, one of the kind of questions is kind of, well, noise also comes with its own host of value systems, and who gets to use that strategically varies. And, especially at our current moment where the politics of noise and silence aren't kind of something in academic discourse, but are, very much actually part of the everyday right now, you know, and I think that there are questions about what bodies get associated with noise and what the implications of those associations are, for sure. So I've looked partly around sort of the relationship between noise and femininity and kind of how bad femininities are understood through noise. But it's also racialized in lots of different ways. It's classed in lots of different ways. There are kind of different kind of identity-based oppressions that intersect with understandings of noise as well. So I guess it's kind of like finding the space between those two things, like seeing the kind of possibilities and potentialities of noise, but also attending to those kind of big questions.
Totally. And you all actually kind of touched on this a little bit, but want to talk a little bit about interacting with this kind of raw sound as raw material. So outside of its musical value, and how some people, we would consider this to be kind of a queer mode of listening. And I wonder if you can speak to any other kind of queer models of production, of diffusion, or any ways to kind of queer this practice of listening and of producing sound.
Well, I try to be really rebellious when it comes to structure, musical structure, or, well, I guess you said that you didn't want it to be about music, but I think when I started DJing and sort of started seeing the way tracks are structured and the way it can be broken up into like the logics of four, and or just working with like the difference of some of my collaborators and the sort of feedback they would give me. And I think recently, like, the more confident I've become and the more consistent and the better I get, I'm like, well, I don't want to follow that structure anymore because I just don't want to keep perpetuating. I mean, I understand the value of it, and if you want other people to play your music in a context of the club and sort of be able to DJ with it, it's like better to follow the formula. But in that respect, I think there's, for me, like, I just wanted to be able to sort of bomb that in a way, and like just as part of my practice, make something that can still be coherent, but not follow like the structure that I don't know. I don't want to say that all males made, but like I have noticed that like within my collective, there is like a difference in the ways in which we view sort of whether, I mean, yeah, we just simply do, not to sound essentialist, but I really feel like I'm less likely to stick to certain formulas, and I don't know if that's, yeah.
I think I've been thinking about this idea of queering something or having a queer modality through expectations. And so the idea that like there's something that someone's expecting when they show up at a certain setting or where they're going to listen to a certain sound, and by having an expectation, like that's really useful in the world, and I don't think, I'm like not trying to say expectations are bad at all, but like those exist, and I think that one thing that they can do is make it really difficult to experience what's actually there, because the expectations can kind of cloud your perspective, and they like expectations are informing your judgments. And so like the thing that I've set up is to try to help people like be together and be listening with less expectation. And so we like almost purposely keep a bit of mystery going on. And then of course like we're creating like a norm and a structure and a set of expectations through all of that. And like, I don't know how to get around that. And I think that that's something that like queer theory talks about a lot, is like how to have this thing called queer and then like always be moving away from it. And then that idea of always moving away from it becomes a norm. And then like, how do you move away from that? Yeah.
I guess like just on a really practical level though, like if we're talking about kind of, it depends if we're talking about kind of queering X or if we're talking about like a queer politics of sound. Because I actually think that a lot of the things that we hold sound and music up for being great for creating community, for creating shared embodied spaces and so on and so forth, for creating relations of care, actually, as well. You know, one of the things that I'm currently thinking through is like listening as a form of labor, actually, and how that's unevenly distributed, and who is expected to listen and who is expected to embody, you know, those processes of listening, and why. And I guess that those kinds of questions are absolutely central to kind of thinking about relations of care that are also central to kind of queer politics. But in terms of kind of saying, I think I'm struggling with the question for the same reason, right? Of kind of pointing to the thing of being like, this is how we do it. This is how we change it. Because I think it has to be situated, actually. But I do think I try really hard not to kind of double down on a kind of sonic essentialism and be like, sound is this magical medium that creates connections and, you know, opens minds and all of the rest of it. But I do think there is something special about music and sound. And I think we can talk about it in ways that doesn't make it this kind of magical social fairy dust as well. I hope.
Yeah, I guess that's a good. Yeah, that's really good to say, because I think, you know, the same part. You know, we're talking about really positive aspects of sound right now, but you know, there's a lot of very negative aspects of sound out there, and sound that does very bad things all the time. Weaponized sound, sound that drowns out others, and to draw on this relation, creating relations. Creating spaces of care for others, and I think that is essential, especially if you're organizing other people, or that needs to be number one, to create spaces of care for others. I also think about a friend of mine, an artist, Colin Self. I always think about the way Colin engages with sound, and always reminds us to stay with the trouble. And at the same time, that you can balance that in trouble spaces, trouble contexts, but at the same time create spaces of care for others who need it. And that creating relations can go very wide, and can go to people through sound and around sound that it could not have gone to otherwise. So, yeah.
This kind of leads into our next point about success and meaningful and unmeaningful sound, or meaningless noise. So how do you think we can kind of move away from ideas of failure, taboo, as well as contradiction when it comes to commercial success or success period within the music industry?
I really liked the article that was part of what we were reading, the DJ Sprinkles. Wait, why are you laughing?
Yeah, I mean, she's definitely a good person to talk about in relation to failure and stuff like that.
Oh, no, I didn't mean it like that. The text actually was just talking about the difference of like the marketplace sort of, yeah, it was for this, right? Like the sort of making this kind of work, attempting to make meaningful work versus like the stuff that's formulaic for commercial or marketplace, and how that can then become the parameter of success or not. I don't know. Sorry, I got a bit like distracted a bit with that. If you want to continue, because I guess, yeah.
No, because I think you're absolutely right, and I guess like you got to eat, right? Like, and you know, while being able to kind of talk about artistic failure is often, you know, something that is reserved for a particular group of people, like sometimes you have to make the compromises around what you do, because you have to be able to reproduce yourself. And that's hard, and those decisions are hard. And I'm more than aware that I occupy a kind of academic position where I can kind of float around kind of talking about, you know, how failure is great, but actually it's really hard. And for lots and lots of reasons, it's really hard. So I guess that doesn't really answer anything, but...
Well, from my own personal experience, I feel it has been really interesting, both working and living in New York, because the economic pressure, both ideologically but also literally, is like higher than from when I was living in Mexico, where my expenses were probably 75% less. And of course, I was remunerated, you know, in that same proportion. So in order for me to, or what has been working for me, I think, and I think I'm being critical, that just being able to have a subsistence from DJing and sort of thinking that like that I'm at the service of the situation, the public, just sort of that being like an actual labor of, and it's for my style and my formula, I think it is very much wanting to resonate with as many of the dancers as possible. However, I do think that I maintain my idealism with my production, and both with the themes that I choose to speak about, or, you know, my album was across genre, or just doing things that, like I said previously, with the group where I'm coming from, where I'm enunciating from, stuff is very just sort of, like it doesn't really go beyond in format, because we're structurally already, like the structural fight is like the big victory that we have had, because we're, you know, producing from Mexico and attempting to be competitive or just sort of relevant culturally, internationally, is like a whole fight in itself. Yeah, so I feel like in my case, what has been so far working is being able to have like a diversity of a practice within sound or music. So DJing, and I'm like, well, I want to be a big DJ, like a super big DJ. And yeah, I guess like I'm already going in wanting to sell out, but my production, like nobody could ever touch that. And like the stronger I am in some things, like the more legible I am, like the less kind of, you know, then I can make weirder things or just, I don't know, something like that has been.
It's all about leveraging things, and
Yeah.
my favorite tool of all time is manipulation, because like, you know, I mean, it's true, and you really need that. And like, some things I was writing down as you were speaking was like, you know, when when Unheard Records started out, and still, I mean, this is a pretty big big venue for us right now. Is we threw shows. I would throw my own personal shows, completely DIY. We would throw shows, no one would come, just like absolutely no one would come. And you know, it feels like a big failure, but I was trying to remind myself that it takes time, and that you have to fail, and you have to fail many, many, many times before anyone is going to care remotely. And all we had to do was we had to continue to care. And so, and the other thing I was thinking about that is in relation to, like, so CBC has that program Reclaimed, and which is Indigenous Sound Artists, and it still blows my mind that it can even exist, or that they even let that on the radio, because you know 10 years ago, who would have thought? Who would have thought? Me coming from the U.S., I would never have imagined remotely, and you know, but to create space for failure, to allow failure, not even failure, but blockages, like people not allowing, and then say like, no, we're gonna just keep going for as long as it takes. And I think that's super important. And you know, our last compilation on Unheard, we had 4 Indigenous sound artists. One of them, Ariel, is in the back. Don't look at him. And you know, to even say that I know. I mean, I know a lot more now, but to say I know 4 experimental Indigenous sound artists, just I'm so happy. I could cry, and that we have venues, and that, you know, but you know, no, it felt like, I mean, it was a short period of time. It felt like no one was listening, and it felt like a failure for a long time. So,
Failure is a feeling.
I like that we're talking about how there can be so many different ways to know that you're being successful and to identify success. And I think that that's something that's really key, is like having a bunch of different things you're trying to cover. So maybe like financial success is important, and like making work that you really want to be making is important. And sometimes those two values will be in conflict and sometimes not. And then like other things of like, oh, I want to be more heard, or I want to like create a new space over here. Like having a bunch of different markers of success, I think, is really important.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because I do think it's important. Like, I see a lot of my colleagues that have to subsidize their artistic sonic music practice through other forms of labor, usually like in the service industry. And I don't think, like, as much as, I mean, we have to pay the bills, like you said, we have to eat, and that's a process. But I do think, for me, it has been important to try to develop, or like success in that respect, like trying to develop strategies to sustainably have a practice, but not all my eggs in one basket, as you were mentioning as well, the diversification of.
I think that idea that people have to subsidize their artistic practice, though, is super interesting, because I guess it goes back to what I was kind of trying to pick at earlier, is like, well, what are the structures that are, why are people doing 2 or 3 jobs? And, the amount of freelance artists I know who are working 4 or 5 jobs in different kind of precarious ways. And I don't know, I think it opens up a lot of questions that I don't think it's on artists to answer necessarily, and I think it's others that need to answer that. How are they measuring success if that's, what's going on? But yeah, I think all of us are probably familiar with the idea of you trade off one form of success in order to have the other. So, you can have the thing that is financially successful, whatever that means, in order to kind of have success in other forms. But that's always a kind of difficult and precarious balance to strike. And yeah, ideally, I guess we wouldn't have to.
I guess I just want to say that one thing that comes to mind is that holding institutions to the fire, like asking institutions to fund people to, if we get into an institution, if we have positions of power, to always make sure you're making space, you're caring for relations, you're looking for people who need that, who need just funding, just bare minimum funding, and and there's a lot of places that do that now, and obviously now I'm continuing to be in university because it really helps to, I can make whatever art I want because I made sure to go get that institutional support. But it shouldn't have to be that way. We should be able to fund artists another way. Yeah.
Absolutely, and the transparency is really I think just the fact that we can talk about this is a little bit of a step in the right direction, hopefully. So we only have a couple of minutes left, so we're gonna have the last question. Which is about automation. So as in a market where every level is increasingly automated, from production, distribution, as well as marketing, we wonder how noise can fit into or break these algorithms. Suzanne, you spoke a little bit about this already, and your love for numbers, so perhaps you can start.
So the question is about noise breaking through distribution?
Yeah, the relation between noise and algorithms.
The relationship between noise and algorithm?
Yeah.
Wow.
Or automation.
Or what?
Or automation.
Automation. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, the only thing that really comes to mind right now, because it is a bit like a big question, thinking about the reproduction, sort of the platforms of reproduction and those changes and how that's having an impact in the actual economics of music. Specifically, I'm thinking about Spotify. But I just sort of to me, it's always been funny, the way the necessity of the market to codify just work within this realm, and with genres, and I don't know, that's why it's funny when the gender is not a genre. I'm like, well, why not? When the market can't identify a beat pattern, or the algorithm, when it's just experimental and everything is just sort of brushed into this huge thing that, to me, all of electronic dance music is experimental, and everything just sort of has its own dialectic. But yeah, so I don't know, I think it's obviously a market, well, not obviously, but I'm thinking it's a market-driven need to codify, just sort of similarly to how before when with records and CDs, like the way music was distributed before, it had to be categorized, like physically with genres. And like now, I guess, I don't know, like similarly, but, or it's a continuation of that, but now it's an algorithm, so it's not human. It is human developed, but in another, now it has another aspect there, like binary.
I finally figured out what I wanted to say. Okay, I was just thinking about the mode of releasing, how it's still important, and most importantly, curation is still super important. You know, you guys curating a group of people, you know, the curating as a label, curating a compilation, because what you're doing is you're creating connections. Every time you have a show, you bring in artists that are totally off the wall, but you know that there's a through line, and what you're doing, and it's like, what about, I don't know what this really means, but hacking the algorithms, you know, telling Spotify, like, you know, these, like 9 of the weirdest, most completely different artists, they're all grouped together in this album. And I think that, and it reminded me of, I was at a symposium and I forgot who it was. This guy was talking about how he went on a really long rant that AI was going to take over all of music making, and that there would be no need for musicians or composers anymore. And he was terrified, but I'm not terrified of that, because I know that there's no way, because no matter what you do, you know, I don't really think you can beat the human touch. Right.
So we only have a minute left, so we're just going to open it up to questions if anybody has anything.
Question. The grindcore of questions.
One question.
Word answers.
You said the grindcore of questions. 1 minute.
Okay, this one's a really quick, curious question. You mentioned that you did some technology with Braids really early in the talk. I was just really curious. Could you elaborate on that?
I'll just go. You can email me. Well, no, because it's a long. I could talk about that for a million years. It's my PhD. It's like, you know, body interfaces. So interfaces, just like we use, just like MIDI interfaces, controlling audio and visual, controlling computers, making relations with computers. Yes. Email me. I'll tell you all about it. Call me.
Yeah.
We'll hang out after. I'll tell you there.
Cool. Is that it? Are we out of time?
I think we had one.
There's one at the back.
First, thank you so much, Mutek, for this important, critical conversation. And I wish we had more time to delve more into this important talking points. I just wanted to bring back the attention to the importance of security and secret keeping in what we do, as we kind of define as space making and space holding or sound making, and that relationship between sound and space, I think, is immediately connected to the whole discourse of radical disembodiment, for instance. And I also think, you know, as an Iranian immigrant woman who has been doing like telepresence, cross-cultural space making for, you know, since 2010, I would be also interested more to think about that type of space as a place for talking about interpretations and act of disembodiment.
I think if I understand you correctly, the question of secrets is a really great one, actually, because a lot of what we talk about is knowledge sharing, the need to share with one another. And the other side of that is actually what we don't want to share and what we don't want to communicate publicly necessarily. And that's a really tricky line to walk when you're talking about building kind of sound and music cultures, like what you want to keep in silence, actually. There are lots of very hard conversations to have that we can't do publicly, for example, for lots and lots of reasons, and that have to be kept within. So I think that's a really, like, it's not answering your question, but I think the question of what boundaries we need to preserve, actually, when we're building spaces, and what we don't allow in, or what we keep out for the time being, is a really great question.
Actually, I just want to add something right in there, because in the nature of what I do, there's a lot about this idea of putting the labor to open up from your country, your place of origin, to make that as a commodity and make it available, accessible to the people.
Yep.
The other side of it is the whole conversation of digital colonialism, which is just really sensitive. And the other angle is the fact that you're putting in danger the possibility of even having these type of encounters and having it to be silenced, as you well mentioned. And in some cases, for instance, in the case of my country, Iran, it's the actual physical danger for the participants and the safekeeping of these spaces. So I think when we talk about celebratory heterotopias and this type of spaces, that is very important, that like how we examine the safety of the places that we talk in or create noise in, and how we hold those spaces.
Yeah, I guess I just want to throw in that you know, in the histories of indigenous sound making, especially female indigenous sound making, like all of that type of stuff speaks to that very directly, and it's a very fraught space. Not being allowed to even sing your songs, being punished by the government, being physically hurt. Those are very real, and they're still real now. And I think that's, you know, those, you know, digital colonialism, I think that's what you said, but, you know, just colonialism at all is still a very pertinent and important topic, especially when it comes to being heard on the very bottom line, like human rights bottom line.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much
for your time and generosity in being here today. And thank you to everyone here, and to MUTEC. This has been great.
Mm.